Interpreters, are you all set? Thumbs up, let me know. If you have what you need, all right, cool beans. Yes. Cool beans.
Hey Tracy,
Hi, Robin. How are you?
good and you?
Hanging in there. You doing all right?
I'm doing okay. I cannot complain.
Here we go. How was Janet Jackson? I saw you went to see her.
Girl, awesome.
Oh,
Oh my God,
good. I'm
I
glad
had
you
so
enjoyed
much
that.
first time seeing her live, so it was a treat.
Okay.
And then Ludacris was good too.
Yeah, I didn't know he was the opener for her. Yeah.
And it was a sellout crowd, honey. The traffic was bananas.
I looked because I didn't know she was going to be that close until much later. And
hmm
yeah, it was just all not under a shed. It was all in the lawn that was left. I was like,
Yes. And Tom Cruise was there, by the way, in the audience.
oh, that was extra. Y'all didn't pay for that, did
We
you?
sure did. And he was people taking pictures with him.
Oh, now that's a thing. There we
Mhm.
go.
Yeah.
Tracy, this is Kelly, one of your Spanish interpreters. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. You asked me to unmute. Would you like me to read that announcement at the start of the session?
Yes, we'll do that. Session starts in the next 7 minutes, 1:15. So I'll turn it over to you and you can do that.
Great.
And I'm
Thank you.
adding the monitoring device. Do you want me to add that as well too?
No, actually, if that one can stay out for now, that
Okay,
would be, yeah, it can stay out. That way I
perfect.
can address the group from the main audio.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Thank you.
Hold on. I think I did something. I messed up something.
Hi, everyone.
You had me nervous. I was sweating.
I was in the wrong Zoom room. I was in the wrong Zoom room. And I was sitting there forever too, just waiting.
And I was sweating under my pitch, trying to hold it together for the crowd. Oh,
Yeah,
no
I like to keep you on
worries.
your toes.
Oh, I appreciate that. You did. Mission accomplished. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the space. Thank you all so much for carving time out of your busy schedules to spend time with NC Casa for the past 2 days. For me, it's just been my heart's joy just to hear and learn and breathe with you and experience and learn with you. So thank you all so much. My name is Tracy Wright, and I will be your moderator today for Reproductive Justice. Oh, now isn't that a timely conversation in North Carolina? Did you plan that?
Sure
No,
did.
sure did, right? And now I want to turn it over into our interpreters for a brief announcement. Unmute.
Thank you. Today's event will be conducted in English with Spanish interpretation as well as ASL interpretation. Anyone who is not Spanish-English bilingual will need to select a language channel. To listen on a computer, locate the globe icon along the bottom row of your Zoom screen and select English. If you are joining via the Zoom app on a mobile device, click More or the 3 dots in the corner of your screen and select Language Interpretation. Then choose English and click Done. Do not select Mute Original Audio. The chat for your reference, and I'll read them now in Spanish. El evento de hoy se llevará a cabo en inglés con interpretación al español. También hay interpretación en lengua de señas estadounidense. Quien no sea bilingüe en inglés y español tendrá que seleccionar un canal de interpretación. Para escuchar el español en su computadora, haga clic en el icono del globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom y seleccione su idioma. Si se está conectando a través de la aplicación Zoom en un dispositivo móvil, haga clic en More, más, o en los 3 puntos en la esquina de la pantalla. Seleccione Language Interpretation, interpretación del idioma. Luego elija su idioma y haga clic en Done. Listo. No seleccione Mute Original Audio, silenciar audio original. Esas instrucciones van copiadas en el chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, welcome to Reproductive Justice. As a reminder, we want to remind everyone to please take care of yourself during this session in whatever way feels right. If that is, oh, I got to step away for a second, or if you're like, hey, can I talk to somebody? We are pleased to be able to offer that. We have an advocate on call throughout this session and actually throughout the totality of the conference. And so if you need those support, please do not hesitate to send me a direct message and I will provide that contact information for you. Your wellness is important and we encourage you to take care of yourselves. I am excited to be in space with you and also to sit and to learn. We have an amazing speaker, is it Simran?
Simran, yeah.
Good job. I thought my Louisiana twang was just gonna mess that all up. Who's a queer Desi activist and poet from Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. Currently settling down roots and building community in Durham, North Carolina, where she relocated in 2021. She graduated from Tulane University in New Orleans, where she studied political science and gender and sexuality studies, and served as a sexual violence response team member and consent educator. Before joining Team Sister Song, she worked at the Center for Community Alternatives, an anti-incarceration nonprofit based in Syracuse, New York, where she provided violence prevention education and after-school programming for youth in the city. Today, Simran is a national membership coordinator with Sister Song and aims to expand grow our reproductive justice community and network. Her journey with Sister Song began in 2019 as an intern through the Reproductive Rights Activist Service Corps, and she is practicing abortion doula. That is amazing. That's so cool. I'm sorry. Simran believes deeply in the power of art to grow movements and uses poetry as a tool for activism. Her work has been published by the Academy of American Poets, Big City Lit, 9 Mile, literary magazine, the South Asian Sexual and Mental Health. So again, like, let's show some love and great appreciation. I'll turn it over to you, Simran.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tracy, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with you. As Tracy mentioned, my background is actually in sexual violence response and education. So throughout college and a little bit afterwards, I was doing hotline work. I was running support groups for survivors of sexual violence. I was doing consent education through my schools and with other young folks. And I continued doing that at the Center for Community Alternatives in Syracuse. And so I have been out of that space now for a couple of years. So it's always really wonderful to get a chance to reconnect with people who are doing the work around sexual and gender-based violence. It's so important and so fulfilling to be able to be part of this. So thank you all for being here. Tracy, are you going to share your screen with my PowerPoint, or am I going to do that?
You are going to do that.
Great. Okay. Okay, everyone, big hold, please, so that I don't accidentally show you my emails or my Netflix. Okay, share screen. Do you see what I want you to see? Yes? Okay, awesome. Present. Bam. Okay. Well, thank you all again for being here. This presentation is going to be an introduction to the concept and framework of reproductive justice. And then we're kind of going to look at reproductive justice as a way to be envisioning a future without violence and a future where everybody has the safety and resources that they need. So I'm going to start with some introductions. I will introduce myself, but I would also love to know who you are. So if anyone is interested, please feel free to drop in the chat your name, pronouns, location, and what brought you to this conference. Just a little something so that I can get to know you a little bit and see who we have in the space. But during this time, I will also share a little bit about me, which Tracy did a wonderful introduction, but I will say that I am currently the membership coordinator for Sister Song, and I have been with Sister Song for about 2 years now, but I was an intern back in 2019. And I'm focused on building our network as the membership coordinator. So getting to speak at these conferences is a really wonderful way to get to connect with a wider group of people and share with people what reproductive justice is, because it is not a household term, despite being something that I think is a really powerful framework to be looking at our current moment. As we mentioned, North Carolina has kind of gone to shit, for lack of a better term, with the policy around abortion. So some very scary stuff going on. So I think it's even more important now than ever to have this conversation. Welcome, Asia. Wonderful. Welcome, Gabrielle. Yeah, thank you all. Please keep introducing yourselves and feel free to chat and get to know each other in the chat. Excited to have you all here. So I'm going to do a little bit overview about what Sister Song. Can you guys see like the little faces at the bottom? Like, am I covering words? No, I'm not. Okay, awesome. So Sister Song is the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. We are the largest and first reproductive justice collective. When reproductive justice was coined as a phrase, Sister Song was created as a collective just a few years later with the intention of being the first collective group of people and activists and organizations who are focusing on this topic specifically. So we focus, our mission is kind of enormous. And so when we share our mission, it says, Sister Song's mission is to strengthen and amplify the collective voices of Indigenous women and women of color to achieve reproductive justice by eradicating reproductive oppression and securing human rights. which is an objectively enormous mission. And I remember when I had my very first day as an intern and I learned what reproductive justice was for the first time. And I remember looking at the person next to me and saying, okay, so it's kind of everything. Like it's all social justice topics, it's everything. That's so overwhelming. And the person next to me said, yeah, but isn't it exciting? And that stuck with me so fundamentally for the rest of my organizing life, is just that, yeah, it is exciting to envision a world where all of these topics that intersect naturally are being discussed as intersecting, and that everybody has the right to thrive, not just the people that we happen to be supporting in that moment. So we have this really big mission that I think is both overwhelming and very exciting. And when we're looking at what we tangibly do, our purpose is to build an effective network of individuals and organizations to improve institutional policies and systems that impact the lives of marginalized communities. So what that means in practice is that I'm working on creating our network and creating our community and making sure that people have avenues to get connected, folks who care about this topic and who care about being part of this community. And then we also have folks on the ground in Georgia, North Carolina, and Kentucky who are doing policy work and on the ground organizing. And we have groups, we have an organizer who does training, so does most of the educational materials. We have somebody who does faith work specifically, so the connection between religion and reproductive justice, and how the ways that religion has been co-opted very much to be anti-abortion, when in reality you can be a person of faith very deeply and have views about abortion that are not what the mainstream tells us they have to be. So we have our hands, and we have our birth justice team, which is really important. So they do things like providing midwives and doulas to people who are birthing, providing diapers, wipes, all the things that people need after giving birth. And through that, we do mutual aid organizing. So we have a birth justice care fund where people can request funds directly to help them take care of themselves through the birthing process and after the birthing process, which is really powerful. So we have our hands in a lot of pieces of the work. And so before we get deeper into this, I like to ground our knowledge in the same, okay, I'm gonna slow down a little bit, sorry. I'm going to ground us in the language that I'm going to be using to make sure that we are all on the same page. So the word that I like, the phrase I want us to discuss first is white supremacy. And I'm putting white supremacy in quotes because white people are not supreme. White supremacy implies that there's some legitimacy to that, and there is no legitimacy to it. However, it does have a very intense impact on our lives, despite them not actually having any sort of supremacy fundamentally. White supremacy has a very deep impact on our lives. So when we look at white supremacy, we define it as, in the US, it is comprised of three forces. One, the chattel slavery of African peoples and its afterlife. When we say afterlife, that's things like the incarceration system that still does not pay people for their labor or pays them very, very tiny amounts, or the long-term just impacts of slavery that have impacted redlining, just redistricting, all the ways that Black folks have not been able to reach the full potential that this country should have to offer. Number two is Native genocide. And number three is that migrants of color are viewed as threats to empire. White supremacy is a system of values and material realities that erase and steal Black and Indigenous and POC contributions to society while simultaneously harming BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the world itself. And so it's a big definition that is meant to really highlight the ways that power is involved in all of this. A lot of times we get caught up in conversation about racism, right? So who's racist, who's not racist, versus actually sitting down and thinking about how white supremacy is a structure that impacts all of us, including Black and brown people. We can all, despite the conversation, it's really easy to get caught up in the conversation about whether or not white people cannot be racist, whether or not brown people can be racist. But in reality, we can all be white supremacists. We can all take those structures and use those structures to our advantage, especially for being able to look at non-Black people of color like myself. White supremacy is something that is about power and about control rather than about the individual and how they are impacted by racism. So, right, white supremacy versus racism. Racism is a cultural system that comes out of white supremacy. It happens at the personal level, that person was racist, or at the institutional level. And racism can be implicit through things like beauty standards, being really focused on the way the white people look, and explicit, for example, hate crimes. So the idea is that white supremacy is the cause. White supremacy is this larger cause that is creating racism. So people act racist because of structures of white supremacy. And so when we talk about it from a perspective of power and control, rather than a perspective of individuals, it allows us to invite more people into the conversation and avoid the defensiveness and general mess that comes with having to have that conversation with people, even though people are racist, like that's a fact, and also being able to have this conversation that's really, really centered on power. And so I'm curious what you all think about this, about the difference between racism and white supremacy, and whether or not you see it as useful, or if there are moments where you've seen that racism was not the most helpful framework, but that white supremacy and power may have been more helpful. Because I think that's something that really sticks with me always, is that white supremacy has a connection to capitalism too. White supremacy acknowledges that, that the bottom part where it says, and the world itself, white supremacy recognizes that corporations, 7 corporations causing like 80% of the carbon emissions in the world is white supremacy. And it's also capitalism. It's this desire to just create, and just be nonstop creating more profit and not thinking about people or the world itself, the world fundamentally. And so being able to have that connection to power and control and profit is, I think, a really important way to look at race as well. So yeah, I want to hear what people think. If anyone wants to jump in. Yeah, there's so much interconnection with systems of oppression. Diana, do you want to elaborate?
Sure, I can. Thank you for sharing, first of all, and it's helpful to kind of consider it in the aspects that you have been sharing, because if we only focus on white supremacy, right, then that's one aspect. But when we kind of take that more broader view, it's like, oh, there's a lot of things that kind of fall under that umbrella. So I appreciate kind of taking that more broader view. So that's just kind of what I was thinking as you were sharing that.
Yeah, totally. It's like, we're fish swimming in white supremacy. Like, it is all around us, versus, whether or not, oh, is that person racist? Is that thing racist? Was that show racist? Versus looking at white supremacy as this thing that is constantly surrounding us, and how do we start breaking down that larger system rather than looking at the individual content. Does anyone else have anything to share?
Folks are just really interested in this and really want to have access to the presentation afterwards, so they can take it back into their respective communities to have these conversations. So I think this is extremely just timely, and folks are really, grounded and ready to continue in the conversation.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. And yes, absolutely. I can send the slides over. Great. All right. I'm going to move forward then, but please feel free to jump in at any time also. So I want to talk a little bit about Sister Song's founding mothers and about the history of reproductive justice more broadly. So reproductive justice was created and coined in 1994. There was a human rights conversation that was going to be happening in Cairo. And so before that event, 14 Black women came together in Chicago, and their intention was to basically talk about the fact that the mainstream reproductive rights movement was so focused on white, cisgender, wealthy women. And it was so focused on this idea of choice. It was focused on, okay, do you have the legal choice to have an abortion? And so they felt like this was not accurately describing their experience, that their people were not actually being protected by this, and that it wasn't a broad enough conversation. So that is both for the fact that abortion, whether or not it's legal, can often be extremely challenging to access, and extremely challenging to access specifically if you are part of vulnerable populations. For example, people of color, people living in rural areas, people of lower income. And so they created this term reproductive justice with the intention of coming up with something that was more inclusive of the most vulnerable people in the movement. And so it's supposed to be this connection of reproductive rights and social justice. So looking at reproductive rights, but with a lens around power that wasn't there before. Before was all about legality and about being able to have the choice. And they said, well, what is choice for people who don't really have a choice? If you have no money, you don't really have a choice. And if you can't get to a clinic, you don't really have a choice. So what does choice mean outside of this legal piece? So, and then on top of that, they also want to expand the conversation out of just abortion, because people of color and low-income people were experiencing reproductive oppression that had nothing to do with abortion and that was not being talked about. So for example, incarcerated people were being sterilized, they were having forced sterilization happen to them. And that was not part of the reproductive rights movement at all, even though it's active modern day eugenics of deciding who deserves to be able to have children and who does not. And that's still happening to this day. Sister Song was actually involved in a coalition in Georgia that just worked to get this women's prison shut down because there was an expose where at minimum 16 women were forced to be sterilized by the prison system, and they were bartered like, oh, we'll lower your sentence if you get sterilized. And so based on that process, they were able to close that prison, which is a win, and also a win within the conception of the fact that they're still in prison and they still moved to a different incarceration location. And yes, Loretta was also the executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, the older rape crisis center in the country. Yeah, that's amazing. She's an incredible person, and she just won a MacArthur Genius Award and got a huge grant to be able to keep doing this work. So she is currently teaching at Smith College, and she was our first national coordinator. And national coordinator is basically just like the executive director. So, oh my God, is it $800,000?
That's how significant it is to continue to do the work that she does. Like,
Oh my God. I'm so
Yeah.
excited to see what she does with it. It's
Right.
unbelievable.
Whatever she
Yeah.
wants. Right.
Whatever she wants. Yeah, no, she's been on the front. She's also such a cool lady. I got to meet her recently and I was like starstruck. But so she was our first executive director. But basically after these women came together and they said, okay, the reproductive rights movement is not speaking to us, it is not representing our needs, we're going to create something different. And so they created this term reproductive justice, and they called themselves the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. And they brought that back to the Human Rights Conference, and that term was born and started becoming popularized from there. So after 1994, in 1997, Sister Song was created as the very first reproductive justice collective, which was an organization. At the time, we were not a nonprofit. We were just a collective, a collection of reproductive justice activists and allies and all of that, which is really what we were for a long time. We only became a nonprofit about 10 years ago, and that was so that we could get access to more funding. And then Luz Rodriguez, so after these 14 Black women came together and created reproductive justice as a term, when Sister Song was created, they brought together 4 different communities of color. So an Asian community, the Black community, the Latinx community, and the Indigenous communities. And they brought together representatives from all 4 of these communities and cultural backgrounds. And together they created Sister Song and Reproductive Justice Collective. And I think that's really beautiful because it's always this reminder that we are fighting a common enemy, which is white supremacy. And the common enemy does hurt us in different ways. There are different struggles between different racial groups, but at the end of the day, there is a common goal here. And reproductive justice was created to support all people of color. It is by women of color, for women of color. And Luz Rodriguez was one of the founders of Sister Song, and she was the actual one who got us our very first seed money. She was working on a project where they were doing research on UTIs in communities of color, and she was in like this meeting basically, and it was all these white men being like, why do communities of color keep getting UTIs? And she was like, why don't we ask them? Like, have you ever thought about asking people and like talking to them about their health? And so that was really what her work was about, is getting people at the table. And so through that process, she was able to make white people stop speculating and start asking big questions. And so she was able to get us our very first seed money from the Ford Foundation to start funding this work. But on top of our direct founding mothers, I also like to talk about how reproductive justice, while the word was coined in 1994, people have been using this framework since the beginning of time. A movement for Black and brown women around their reproduction, like that's something that organizers and activists have cared about forever. And so I like to always take us back a little bit to the reproductive justice founding mothers who didn't know what the words reproductive justice were, but who were doing that work. So Sojourner Truth, and specifically around Ain't I a Woman? So looking at the ways that white women were experiencing one specific thing around their womanhood, and Black women who are also women were experiencing something very, very different. So being able to have that conversation about intersectionality and about intersecting identities long before intersectionality was a word too. Audre Lorde, who said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, which is literally describing intersectionality. So just looking at the ways that we have so many identities of oppression and privilege that impact the way that we move through the world and the way that we do the work. So and Bell Hooks, who, okay, her name should be on lowercase, but I'll fix that. Zero, I started writing a book on love because I felt that United States was moving away from love. And I really like this. I don't know, has anyone read All About Love? Yeah, I just read it recently. Big fan. And also I love thinking about how love is so central to the work that we're doing. I think it's really easy to get bogged down by all the pain and all the suffering and the abortion bans and the violence and all the sad things are going out around in the world that we want to make better. But something really beautiful to me is always just the community of people that we are connected with. So being here is so special. Just reminding myself that love and joy are at the center of everything that we do. And that's why we do what we do. So now I am going to get into the framework of reproductive justice and what it fundamentally is. So reproductive justice was intended to expand us beyond the conversation of choice. So people were talking about reproductive health. And what are like some organizations or groups that you think of when you think of reproductive health? You can either put it in the chat or come off mute. Planned Parenthood? Yeah? Yes, Planned Parenthood, perfect. Yes, that's a big one that people think of, but clinics, your doctor's office, the OBGYN, any of these things are all about reproductive health. So a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being in all matters relating to the reproductive system. Tracy, did you have something to say? No, you good, okay. Yeah, so just that health process of doctors and therapists and all of that. And then the reproductive rights piece is that legal aspect, which is very much under attack right now. So the legal rights and freedoms relating to reproduction and reproductive health. So that's abortion bans, that's being able to get contraceptives over the counter. All of those things is related to reproductive rights from a legal perspective. And then reproductive justice is what we put as the intersection of all of these things with social justice. So centering the lived experiences of marginalized people and identifying, navigating, and transforming oppressive systems. So it looks at this bigger picture of, okay, you have reproductive health, now what? Who has reproductive health? Who actually has the access to get it? Who actually has the access to reproductive rights? Like when we have these fundamental things like health and rights, who is actually being able to live that experience, and what are the barriers for vulnerable people in those moments of being able to access these things that should be fundamental human rights. And so I think that what was really central to the reproductive justice movement is about being able to center those most vulnerable people, because when we center the most vulnerable people, everyone gets the liberation and freedom that they deserve. And I want to also note that reproductive justice is not in competition with reproductive rights. It is just an extension of reproductive rights and an extension of that framework. So there are 4 tenets to reproductive justice. The first one is every individual has the human right to decide if and when they will have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth. Number 2 is every individual has the human right to decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. Number 3 is the right to parent the children they already have with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the state. that's the one that really resonates with me as like the big picture of it all too, where I think that a lot of people claim to care about babies and don't actually care about the children that come after you have babies, or after fetuses are fetuses, they become kids and they become families. And so how are we actually taking care of children and families after they are born? So looking at not just the conditions of which people are born or not, or the ways that people choose to end a pregnancy, but then also after children are born, how do we make it so that people can raise their children in the way that actually feels true and authentic and without fear of violence from individuals or the state? So I think that's very central to the conversation that we're having today around sexual violence, but also from the state. That brings up the conversation of police brutality and war. And then the final one is every individual has the human right to bodily autonomy, free from all forms of reproductive oppression. And I like to note that this one was actually added recently by our current executive director, Monica Simpson. She has been our executive director for between 7 and 10 years, but I can't remember. And so she's the person who added that. It was not in the original framework. And she added it with the intention of being more explicitly supportive of our trans siblings, because like every movement, there are growing pains. And the reproductive justice movement, when it was first created, was very focused on cisgender women. And as time went on, we said, that's not how it works. That's not going to fly. Like, we care about everybody and we care about vulnerable people, and trans and non-binary siblings, those are our people. And so being able to add something like that specifically talks about bodily autonomy and the right to control your own body is something that we wanted to add with the intention of reminding ourselves that we are more than just our roots, and being able to know that we can change and shift. And I think that's something really beautiful. I think that a lot of people are afraid of admitting that they were wrong at any point, or that they need to change and shift. So being able to be part of a movement that is so open to not knowing everything and learning more and then shifting once you learn more, I think is really important. I would love to hear, so obviously there are 4 huge categories, and there are some more obvious ones and then some less obvious ones of what comes up in each category. I would love to hear if we can brainstorm a little bit about just a few things that would fit into each category. So, like in the first one, the human right to decide if and when they will have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth. Does anyone want to shout out some important topics or issues that would fall under that category? Yes, sex education. Perfect. Yeah, how can you decide how to
Food
have,
insecurities,
would you say?
like access to food,
Mm-hmm.
access to birth control in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What about the next one? The right to decide if they will not have a child, which also birth control and sex education, they all intersect, right? Abortion, yep.
Also, if they
Poverty.
have the available resources, like planning ahead, like, will I have the resources and the means to be able to raise this child after, or raise this child?
Totally.
I feel
Yeah.
like this kind of falls underneath all of them, but I often think about socioeconomic status and how a lot of times I've seen folks bring children earthside, and then and forgive me for the way this is coming out, but then they are impoverished, right? Or they're putting the child into a toxic environment based off of what has happened to them via their experiences with white supremacy and how they're situated in the world, but also based off of what their familial relationships are like, what their social relationships are like with the community that they have around them. So when I think of reproductive justice, I think about more than just when the baby is in utero, right? Thinking about what types of environments we are about to bring these children into, and how we're going to set them up to fight against the odds of white supremacy and all the other things that we have against us.
Yes, absolutely, Asia. Thank you for saying that. And I totally agree that we actually do a training about healing justice. And I think that there's something really relevant there too, where there's of course like the material realities, but there's also the trauma that parents have experienced in their life and that their parents have experienced that gets passed down through generations. And if you don't deal with that, it goes right on to your kids too. And that's something that we all need to be like thinking about, how we're grappling with our own experiences and our own trauma, and not just putting that back into our children, both from the ways that we raise children, but also from this epigenetic piece. Like trauma lives in our bodies fundamentally. And it can be passed down through DNA. So being able to have that healing conversation with families is also so important.
I think also we talk a lot about like birth control for like women. And I also think about kind of on the other end of like for men having a vasectomy versus a woman having her tubes tied or anything to that capacity. I do find that kind of in the options of preventing, we should also include that part. I think is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes two to make a baby. And I think that we kind of forget about that sometimes, which I think it's important to focus on the person carrying and the pregnant person in their decision. But I feel like those people get out the hook. Like we should be having that conversation of, there was two people involved in that. Where are you? What is your responsibility to this process? What about the bodily autonomy free from all forms of reproductive oppression? Is that bringing up anything for everybody? Okay, I'm really thinking about all of the anti-trans bills that are happening right now across the country, especially for trans youth, but for adults as well. And yeah, reproductive coercion prevention, both on an intimate partner level and state violence level. Absolutely. Yeah, Rebecca, do you want to speak more to that? Because that's a huge topic. But no pressure if you want to stay in the chat. Oh, yes, totally. Yes, reproductive coercion is huge, both in all directions, right? Coercion to have abortions, coercion to keep children, coercions to make babies on both state violence and intimate partner level. And I think those are pretty connected in regards to how power works. Does anyone else want to speak to the reproductive coercion before we move on?
Yeah, something else I want to say, it's kind of it kind of ties in with like white supremacy, is that a lot of the times what happens is, you know, a lot of people from different cultures feel coerced, like you said, about to have children. And unfortunately, with white supremacy, they overlook how that impacts the families, like not just like on on the emotional level, but also just like on every other level, being like coming from a marginalized group that has been oppressed, and all these systems are put in place for you to not be able to raise this child with the appropriate means and resources. So, you know, with like this like white supremacy mindset, it kind of just saying like, oh, you should just be able to raise your kid and that's it. But unfortunately, if you're not white, it's a lot more difficult than just raising your child. There's a lot more things, like we were talking about, like intergenerational trauma, like how that's just like passed down from generation, as well as just like the socioeconomic status that comes. Like, I mean, what about the people that are immigrants or people that, you know, that are, as well as trans and LGBTQ, all these people have limited resources because they don't fit the specific model here in the US. And so that just kind of limits to what resources and what they have available to them to be able to truly raise a child, or, you know, make that decision that they don't want that in general too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lack of cultural competency amongst the medical system, amongst the political system. There's not a lot of understanding of the ways that our backgrounds impact our ability to raise children or our ability to make decisions to not raise children. And I feel like there's something for mothers, especially. I think that when people struggle to parent, it's seen as a personal failing rather than a symptom of a larger structure that is working against. So that's also extremely challenging. It's like, oh, if you can't do it, it's because you're doing something wrong. Awesome. Thank you all for that conversation. And we're going to go into another one. So, well, I'm not going to make you do the top. You can if you want to. Describe the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice in your own words. I normally just include this if folks want to just like kind of articulate the thoughts that are on your mind. And then also I want to talk about what are examples of times when you've seen the reproductive rights framework being limiting, and how can reproductive justice help to expand the conversation on that issue? And then the last question I had was, how can the reproductive justice framework be used to discuss issues of sexual and gender-based violence, since that's what this conference is about? So feel free to respond to any or all of those. I just want to kind of get a dialogue going. I'm thinking about, with the limiting one, how reproductive rights can be limiting. I'm thinking about the ways that, like, recently with all of the abortion bans going on, people have been like, oh no, this is horrible. Like, now people won't be able to get abortions. It's like, yeah, it's gotten worse, but people couldn't get abortions beforehand either. Not vulnerable people. Before this, before Roe v. Wade was overturned and before these local bans or any of it, it was still extremely challenging for people to get abortions, especially people in red states. People were traveling to North Carolina. Now they'll have to travel to Virginia. But yeah, just looking at the ways that that narrative about, oh, we had reproductive rights and now we don't, failed to recognize the lived realities of marginalized people. Yeah, Asia.
I just can't help but think of two different things. I think of how much more limiting this will be for, or like it can be for like non-binary folks and trans folks, which we covered in the previous slides. But I also think about, so I currently work on a college campus. So I'm in like the higher ed realm of victim advocacy. And so I can't help but think about how looking at this framework, just how inclusive we are able to be within the way that our institution is set up, and thinking about, okay, if we can't provide certain, I guess, like treatments and like medical needs and right access to that, how am I going to be able in my role to safely recommend a community resource to a student that I'm working with, right? Just kind of thinking about how we would need to kind of just change our own practices within the medical sense, because I do work, it's kind of interesting because victim advocacy falls under student health at my institution. And so kind of thinking about what it means to merge those two almost different sides of the world and figure out how we can best serve the students in an inclusive way, because about a third of the students that I am providing advocacy services for are LGBTQ plus identifying.
Yeah, thank you for that. When I was doing sexual violence work at school, it was also under student health, and it was really strange to see the ways that you kind of send people to the health center or to, like, I don't know, these resources that should be useful, but that are not trauma informed or not queer informed, or just don't have the knowledge to work with marginalized communities, that, or even just survivors, like, are not prepared to be working on people who are experiencing trauma in real time. And it's very jarring where it's like, yeah, how do you recommend people resources that could do harm to them? But then what do you do? Not recommend resources. So that is something that I think is really, really poignant.
As far as like, what are some examples of times you've seen the reproductive rights frameworks be has been limiting? Probably it's something we've specifically talked about is like how, you know, there is technically access to healthcare and there technically is access to birth control and abortions and such, but it is limited because based on your socioeconomic status, your gender, your sexuality, your cultural background, all those things, it limits how much access you really do have to it. Because I mean, we have seen it, we're pretty, I think most of us are aware that unfortunately people of color typically have lower rates of insurance or less insured than, you know, non-BIPOC people. And
Yeah.
so that really limits to what reproductive rights you actually can have, because although you do have those rights, like how capable are you able to get, like how capable are you to get that, or how likely are you able to get that? Like if you don't have insurance, if you don't have transportation, if you have a low paying job or a minimum wage job that doesn't pay sick days, that doesn't pay all these things and stuff like that, like you can't just be expected to take a sick day and just go get an abortion, that's it, or go to a doctor and get some birth control, things like that. Unfortunately, people that are marginalized have so many more obstacles to overcome. And because the reproductive rights are framed for or are for a specific type of person, then, you know, it's not that accessible to everyone. And so I guess with reproductive justice, what it could really do is just focus on how to make it truly accessible to everyone, not just one group of peoples, but everyone, and just really making sure that everyone's being advocated for and included, and it really is inclusive, not just for one specific population.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, like what is choice when you don't have a choice? So yeah, expanding past that idea of choice and into the idea of access. I'm thinking about how the new abortion ban in North Carolina has, since you brought up the leaving work thing, because I feel like that's something that is people don't even talk about as much. Like it's like about like, oh, traveling across state lines, or like not being able to pay for the abortion, but like you're gonna get fired if you leave work for a couple days. Like that's simply not an option for a lot of people. And this new bill, on top of being a 12-week ban, which is already heinous, but it has a lot of other really scary things. Specifically, now there is a 3 appointment minimum to be able to get an abortion, and those 3 appointments have to be 72 hours apart. And the first one cannot be on Zoom, even though the consultation used to be allowed to be remote. Now it has to be in person. So like, it's so hard, especially if you're coming out of state. It essentially just like, if you make enough little barriers, little rules, you're going to make it impossible. And that's exactly what they're doing. I'm also thinking about the medical system and the like OBGYN system specifically, and about how like, I don't know if y'all remember this, but I remember a few years ago, Beyonce was like, oh, here's all the ways the doctors were dicks to me when I was giving birth. And like, it's because I'm Black. And I was like, dang, it even happened to Beyonce. Like race and class are so deeply connected. And also like, they do breathe on their own as things like this. Like even Beyonce and Serena Williams are having shit experiences trying to be in the medical system. And so like, it's been, I mean, when Black people have Black doctors, the chances of maternal mortality go way, way down. And that's not even bringing up the conversation of who has insurance or who has access to resources. So yeah, the importance of having doulas too. I don't know if everyone knows what a doula is. Do you want to explain? Is it Asia or is it Aisha?
It's Asia.
Asia.
So I don't have like the perfect definition, but all I know is that as a Black woman, I need one to help be my advocate as I'm going through the stages of giving birth and just advocating. A doula advocates for the needs of the birthing parent. I think there's also like some ancestral pieces there. Yeah, so if somebody else wants to help me out with the definition, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, Asia, can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, so Asia, I don't know if you know that I was in this too, but Alunda here, and Asia and I work in the same office. But I used to be a birth doula that attended births in hospitals for this very reason, for lots of these reasons. So I always, yep, that's your girl right here. I always just let people know that I served as a liaison between the birthing family or the mother who chose to give to her, or chose the adoption route, whatever it was, then I was the liaison between that person birthing and the hospital staff in general. And the things that I saw they were just not ideal, but that was a part of being in the throes of it, where the things were happening, so to speak. But also being able to serve women in a physical way and a supportive way, emotionally, having different ways after studying under midwives to know, just little tricks of how to avoid a cesarean, or this is the window for this medication, but right. So the risk versus the benefit to both mom and babe, the birthing person and the babe. So.
Do you feel comfortable explaining the difference between a doula and a midwife? We had that question in the chat.
Oh, absolutely. So
Right.
as a doula, I worked completely I didn't work with any of the physical parts of delivering or helping the babe come our side of it. That it was more kind of being there on the sidelines where the midwife is fully in. So anything quote unquote medical, even though it's not all medical, but that's just kind of the language that we're more familiar with here in the US. Anything that could be considered medical or stepping into that. So even in a home birth, if sutures are needed, then the midwife would be the one to do that and not the doula. So even in births where there was a midwife present and I was the doula, it was in support of all parties involved. And also being able to tap in there when the midwife was like, yeah, that's more your lane, right? It's like a team of birth partners to help, because natural birth is long,
So long.
and things can go all kinds of ways. It's unpredictable. So it's very tiring work in a good way, but it's good to have that team of support and collective. Was that helpful?
That was really helpful. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Just midwife is medical, they're trained in a different way. They're trained to be able to do those medical things, and doulas are support people and there to advocate for the birthing person and their needs and their desires, especially across a medical system that is not always having the parents' best interest in mind. So being able to remind them oh, didn't you say that you didn't want a C-section? Didn't you say that you wanted to try and do a natural birth if you can? You're in the most vulnerable point in your life. You're about to give birth, and sometimes you need somebody to just give you a little extra love and a little extra support and advocacy in that moment. And birth doulas are definitely the most common type of doulas, but I want to also share that doulas exist in all kinds of things. So I personally am an abortion doula, and I focus on abortion specifically. So I work with people who are choosing to have an abortion. I go to the clinics with them if they're having a procedural abortion, or I'll be at home with them if they're doing a medication abortion, and then the aftermath of how they're feeling about that process. So it's very emotional work, and it's human. I always say that doula work's human work, because you can get all the special training in the world, but people have been doing doula work since the beginning of time, especially Black and Brown communities, and especially Indigenous communities. This is just what we do. I bet your grandmother was helping somebody through a process of reproduction. I bet your great grandma was. I bet your great 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 grandma was. That's what we do in our communities, is take care of each other. And so getting doula training does help you to have just a little bit more tools in your toolkit on how to take care of people throughout abortion, through death, through miscarriage, through birth, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it's human work, and I can support you with a little bit more information, but nobody can like love on you better than your best friend. So I think that there's something really important too about training and giving people, as many people as possible, access to the information that doulas have, so that you can have the most comfortable birthing experience possible, or anything else. I also know people who are death doulas, like they'll like guide you through the process of dying, or guide your family through the process of somebody else dying in their family, which is really interesting. So yeah, it's such an interesting space. To like actually be working with somebody who is coming to terms with their death is really fascinating. So it's very like emotional and heart work. Awesome. Okay, so I have like 20 minutes left, so I'm gonna keep going, but I want to, at the end, we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more. But before we end, I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality. So intersectionality is the ways that our identities intersect. So it's a complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So whether that's you're a white woman who's a lesbian, like those are three different intersecting identities, and they make you. So they are not additions to one another. You are not just woman plus lesbian plus white. You are a white woman lesbian. And that is its own unique identity, its own unique struggles, and its own unique privileges come from that. And so this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor. And the video is kind of long, so I might just explain what she says in it so that we don't waste a little bit of time, because I want to have time to do Q&A at the end. So, but basically, the history of intersectionality as a term being coined by Kimberly Crenshaw is that there was a woman, a Black woman, who was going into a mechanic's office and looking for a job, and they refused to hire her. And she took it to court. She said, this is on the basis of my identity as a Black woman. They're not hiring me. And the court system said, oh, well, we can't prove that this was discrimination because there are Black men working as mechanics and there are white women working at the front desk. So we can't prove that you are being discriminated as a Black person, and we can't prove that you're being discriminated as a woman. So therefore, there is no discrimination, which is bonkers bananas and doesn't make any sense. And so the concept of intersectionality was coined as this legal term to say, no, people and their intersecting identities create their own unique identities, and those unique identities can be discriminated against in and of themselves. It's like, I think she uses the metaphor that like, it's like you get hit by a car at an intersection and they tell you that you can't get medical help unless you can prove which road you were hit on, but you were hit at the center. So it was originally coined as this legal term to be able to get discrimination cases through the courts, but then has since then been used as something that's really useful in organizing and in understanding our own identities. And like I mentioned before, theorists have been thinking about intersectionality since the beginning of time, like Audre Lorde, like Sojourner Truth, but they did not have that language for it. And so Kimberly Crenshaw really put language to this concept and this framework. And so she says, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and it's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So like that woman who went into the mechanic's office, or the way that I see it is that intersectionality is the grounding for reproductive justice as a theory. So reproductive justice was created because the reproductive rights movement was erasing what happens to people who are subject to multiple identities. It was focused on just women, white women. White women are experiencing this. White women are losing their right to choose. So we care about abortion from a legal perspective. But what about all these people who are subject to multiple identities? Black women, brown women, LGBTQ people, all these people with these multiple identities were being left out by the reproductive rights movement. So reproductive justice is intersectionality in practice. This is just a little graphic of different identities so that you can start thinking about your own, and I can share mine just to give a little bit of an idea. So I am a woman most of the time, she, they. I am Indian, I am brown. My family are immigrants and they came here from India when they were in their 20s. My father specifically came after college. I am 24, so I'm young. I am able-bodied. I speak English as my first language. I am Sikh and Jain, which are two minority religions, both in India and then very, very minority here. I am college educated. I grew up upper middle class. I am a queer person. So those are my intersecting identities. And those are ways that you can kind of look at your own and start thinking about it. And so I want to hear from you all. What is a complex aspect of your identity that others have trouble seeing? And how has your privilege prevented you from seeing others? And then after we talk about, you and unpacking who you are and how your identities have been seen, I want us to kind of look outward to this bigger question of how identity plays into the way that we view sexual violence in our culture.
I don't want to take up a lot of space here, but I love talking about this stuff. And so I think that for me, one of the things that I often think about when it comes to the way that we view sexual violence in current culture is thinking about who is actually allowed to have sexual violence done to them, right? So thinking about what does a victim of sexual violence look like? It's normally portrayed as a cisgender white woman, right? Black and brown women, we are often hypersexualized. We have a history of being hypersexualized and not even being seen as human for so long. And even in ways today that it's like when these things happen to us, it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, they were asking for it, right? Or there are other historical contextual reasons why we are not seen as valued as white women. So I often think about the history of what that looked like. And even within the Black community, specifically thinking about Black women in the slave trade, what it meant to be used to just be a body, just to be a vessel, but not actually be looked at as a human being, being looked at as an animal or a product, right? Being able to bear children just so they could have more slaves on the plantation, and looking at what that means, the different forms of violence that has been put onto our bodies without respect for, again, us being as a human being. Those are the things that I think about when it comes to the intersections of identity around sexual violence.
Thank you, Asia. I really appreciate, you have nothing to apologize for about taking up space because I really appreciate all of your insights. It's super powerful. And yeah, even our children, even Black and brown children and young girls are adultified. Like, we're hypersexualized and we're adultified. They don't get to have childhoods. You don't get to have childhoods. You are immediately a woman who needs to have responsibility around who she is, even at the age of 11 or 12, which is extremely jarring. And I'm thinking about when I was working in the university setting, we would do like bystander intervention trainings. And I was always just like, I remember reading about how Black and brown women would intervene on white women who seemed like they were like potentially experiencing violence or too drunk or whatever it was to go home with somebody, like being able to intervene when they recognize there's a threat, but that white women will never, ever, ever intervene with Black or brown women. And I was just like, nah, fuck this. Like, I was like, this is not what my organizing is. Like, I don't want I care about doing sexual violence work, but I do not exist just to protect white women. And so that was something that I really had to grapple with when I was doing sexual violence work, is how do I do this in a way that is not just me being like a little cog in protecting white women from men specifically. And so, yeah, being able to look at how queer people, and like, how do you jump in when you see two women together? Like, does anyone actually know how to jump in and know when to bystander intervene then? So being able to, yeah, as a young brown queer person, looking at that intersection is so important. Does anyone else have thoughts? Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just kind of bouncing off of that. That's something that I also have a really difficult time in the aspect of my identity, and I have trouble seeing with other people. And it's just that for the longest time, like I've always been taught that I was wrong in society. Like I was not the right one. Like there was something wrong with me. There was something wrong with my culture. There was something wrong with my family, my language, all these things. Because I am also, like I'm a Latina, I'm educated. I'm first generation graduate, the first in my family to graduate college, the first in my family to go to grad school and all these things. And so I've done all these accomplishments, but it's been so exhausting that up until recently, just the last couple years, everything I did felt like it was not good enough because it wasn't done but it wasn't a white person. I'm not a white person that's done it. And that kind of led to some resentment in a way. And I hate to say it like that, but it really did, because I was like, at the end of the day, like, I am, someone that grew up speaking 2 languages my entire life. But, here comes this white person that learned Spanish through college and stuff. And all of a sudden it's really cool that they speak Spanish and English, but it's not cool, and it's not a big deal that I do it because it's expected to do it. But if you don't speak Spanish as, a Latino or Hispanic growing up, then you're called a no sabo kid, so it's like you can't win either way. And so it's like up until recently, constantly felt like I was competing with white people. And a lot of that I held resentment towards. And I always had to do like constant check-ins with myself. And I was very honest with my supervisors too, because I work with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And sometimes I find myself, falling, like sometimes even falling to the same ideologies that white people have, because I'm around it all the time, but I'm like, no, I have to bring myself back. Like, for example, I'm sure that a lot of people have noticed this, but people of color, I mean, Black people, brown people, indigenous, all people, or they whenever they're talking about their traumas, they seem to just not realize how traumatic it really was. Or they're kind of like, oh yeah, that was just like how I was growing up. Or like, oh yeah, my mom and dad always fought and my dad always hit my mom in front of me, but that's just kind of how things were. And it's just like, it's so unfortunate, because that's why it became this stigma, or this myth became about that Black and brown people can hold on to more trauma and more pain and all these things because they don't react to it. But the reality is they don't react to it because they've grown up around it for so long that their body, and unfortunately they're used to it when they shouldn't be used to it. And so sorry, I'm like just ranting at this point. But it has made it hard for me because I constantly have to be checking in with myself and seeing like, of course, I want to help my people that I know have been struggling since the moment they've been here, since the moment they were born and before they were born. Like, they've always been set up with all these challenges, but then I also have to check myself and see, like, am I making sure that I'm providing care for everyone and advocacy and empathy and sympathy towards everyone? Because I understand the pain and to some extent, I can empathize and sympathize with the pain and the trauma that everyone else, that other people of color have gone through, because I have gone through it a lot too. And so when a white person comes to me, it's really hard for me. So I have to make sure I'm being very mindful in those moments. And so I think a lot of the times that just really can sometimes affect how we view sexual violence in our culture. It's just that we're so used to certain genders and certain as well as like marginalized groups and oppressed groups to speak about sexual violence in a specific way. We kind of also have to help guide them and help them realize that it's not okay. This shouldn't be a norm as well. So there's just a lot to be said about all of that.
And I think the thing that I want to chime in and lift up is because I think that the thing that people have to understand is like we have to reckon and sit with all people of color, definitely have to sit with understanding anti-Blackness and how Black people in this country have been treated for histories, like for generations upon generations upon generation. And they've never, like everything we've talked about today, right? Think about the things we talked about today. We talked about Me Too, right? That was created for Black people. And white people co-opted, right? Every time we start all these presentations, conversations around, oh, let's acknowledge like where Black women carried, all of these burdens. And yet even in these spaces, like they are erased, right? And when all of us, including people who are people of color, who are not Black, when we can all center ourselves in understanding how Black people have been treated in this country, things will be better for everybody. And I think what happens is we all prescribe to the master's tools, and then we start creating these segregation. We start using these same tools to separate ourselves, right? And then not to acknowledge the trauma and the pain of Black people in this country who've been stripped of those things. And so I think that when that happens, when we can sit and settle and acknowledge that and do the repair work in that regard, I think things will be better for everybody. But until that happens, right? Until that happens, things will show up in the same way that they do. Because one thing I know about white people will always do the white thing instead of the right thing sometimes. So, that's my point of privilege in thinking about this, especially with all the brilliance and the thought leaders here, thinking about these things, and how, like, even in these conversations, there is this, we've all been trained to erase Black people from this narrative and this acknowledgement that Black people were chattel, like we were property to this country, built this country. And the moment that there was this resistance, then this narrative around, like, think about it, like I'm doing some research and understanding that the narrative that there was never a chance from slavery where Black women could ever be considered legitimate sexual assault survivors because of the possession and the myths around Black women that continue to stand in place. Even if we don't acknowledge it, it still shows up in how we provide services and advocacy. So just holding all, like the last person shared, like just all of it, right? It's a lot.
Thank you, Tracy. The chat's blown up for you because yes, that was amazing and so true. And you're right. Like until we grapple with that history, we're never gonna be able to move forward. And anyone who's not ready to have that conversation is like going to be stuck in their own trauma too. So how do we all come together and have that conversation? Because you're totally right. We're wrapping up at 2:30, right? I got 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. Okay, that leads us in. I have one, well, I can go through this. Anyway, our vision for reproductive justice, which I have beef with this baby because I don't think it's that cute. But it's been in this PowerPoint forever. So okay, you can stay, baby. Our vision for reproductive justice: when all people have the economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, sexuality, and reproduction for ourselves, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives. So that's what we think about when we think about our vision for what reproductive justice really looks like in practice. And the last question I want to leave you with is, how can we use the reproductive justice framework to better support survivors of sexual violence? How can we use this concept to actually be there for people and meet them where they're at? And then after that, I just have a Q&A. So I'm going to lump them together for 5 minutes. We're going to discuss this. Flash if you have any questions. We got this last couple minutes to go through it.
Just know we still with you. We just overwhelmed and just trying to figure out, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, how
I
can
know.
we really move towards the action and the organizing? I believe that is needed, right? Because, and paying attention, and how do we organize in a meaningful way
Yes.
around all of these things? Yeah, just really just trying to take it all in.
Oh, I feel you. No, it's 2 days straight of having these conversations. I am sure that y'all are exhausted. There's a lot to take in here.
But I'd say, like, in some spaces, like, it is welcoming to have them in spaces to share fully, right? Because we know that the real resistance is once we go out into community, right? So it has been helpful and healing and rejuvenated to be in space with folks who don't have to have the answers, but are thinking critically about how do we do this?
Right, right. Well, I will say that this space has been very healing for me as somebody. I mean, I left the sexual violence space because of it was so white. The environment that I was in was extremely white, extremely focused on protecting white women. And it was also very focused on punitive measures. Like we had the police come in and talk to us about what they do when you find out about sexual violence. And I was like, I don't know that the police are the answer. And there was no space to have that conversation about how to restore our communities, especially when sexual violence is happening within our own communities. How do we rebuild after that? And so it's really, really healing for me to be in the space with all you who are having these conversations that are bigger than just just the very easy, how do we punish people? And yeah, Robin, please.
Robin.
Yeah, I think that we can start having the conversations. I work on a college campus in Winston. I'm at Salem College. And so we have actually started having these kinds of conversations. And I am so excited to have been a part of this discussion that I can share with the campus. But we've been having this hard conversation. So I think a way that we can be supportive is educate on our college campuses and start the discussion, because we know it's not going away.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's really great to hear that those conversations are happening, Robin. Yeah, Diana.
Yes, I think one thing that I want to add, I know we're coming to an end for today, but I am always reminded I started my work in working with survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And it's always, I feel like the onus is on us, on women of color, on women to solve this issue. And I think about what are we teaching our young boys? What are we teaching our men to create spaces where women are not in places of fearing men, kind of in that very binary system, I would say. So I just think about how can we also educate boys, and how can we educate our parents and our fathers to teach boys and young men to not exert physical violence. And also I think about men and boys need healing too. And I think that this idea of like boys don't cry, like that very like gendered role of like boys don't cry, or you have to be strong, you have to be a man. I think even engaging in those conversations can also help a lot in just giving space to reducing sexual violence. So I just wanted to share that.
Oh man, we're at the top of time. Like everybody, let's show some love. Like this was amazing. Like you were great. At like everybody, we got resource sharing and connections happening in the chat. And that is because of you. Like you ushered in thoughtfulness and intentionality and invited us into a really, really amazing conversation. So thank you all. Thank you so much for that. Everybody, please, like we want to get your feedback on this. I, for one, am definitely going to advocate for us to continue to have these conversations, organized and building strategies, learning from what other people are doing in there. What barriers are you all facing? There you go. So everybody, thank you all so much. It's been great. Thank you so much, Simran. You were great. And now what's on the agenda? I don't know. I'm so excited. I was so engulfed. I was not prepared to be that engaged, but I should have known I would have been.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you all so much.
Like,
I really appreciate you.
people learned a lot. We really, and yes, we would love to get copies of this and we'll share it back with you all. Everyone, where are we going? I think everybody's going back into the large breakout room for the closing plenary. Thank you all so much. Everyone, take care. Thank you so much to our interpreters. We wouldn't have been able to do this without you. We appreciate you. Everyone, take care. Stay safe, and we'll be in contact soon. Bye.
Bye, Tracy. Thank you.
You're so welcome.